Hi everyone, this is Alan McKay, and first of all I want to congratulate you on completing video 1 in the destruction class. We're in the early days of this class and there's so much awesome stuff coming, like advanced dynamics and fracturing, including adding detail to the fragmented geometry, so they're not all flat pieces, and making them feel more like realistic rock. Explosions, pyroclastic dust from the collapsing building, smoke, fire, and plenty of secondary effects, exporting and rendering everything, compositing, and so much more. As well as a lot of bonus lessons specifically talking about glass, joints, wood fractures, metal, bending and deforming, and lots of other topics as well. I've gotten a lot of email, which I'm going to be trying to spend the next few nights replying to everyone that I can. So if I haven't replied to your email yet, keep an eye out on your inbox soon. One quick thing for anyone using any earlier version of Max, or if you want to do the training in a different software package like Maya, Houdini, Blender, or Cinema 4D, you're welcome to follow along with this training. I've seen students of mine in my mentorship follow this training in other packages because it's explained so in depth rather than focusing on just learning the buttons and not really having much context around it. I'm trying to teach you the ways that these techniques work so that it translates over to any package very easily because we're understanding what we're doing. I've seen plenty of great success with my students in my courses doing exactly this. So that being said, I just uploaded a Max 2017 file as well as Alembic files as well. So if you aren't using Max 2020 or later, you can still download these files and follow through with the training. So in this video, we're going to dig into Phoenix FD and create some fire and smoke for the ship that's crashing into the building. I think this is going to be a fun introduction to Phoenix and a chance to really explore how to get really great results in a production environment with Phoenix. We're going to cover a lot in the simulation work with Phoenix in this training, so this lesson is just the beginning. Finally, while you watch this, as I mentioned, this training is completely free. The way that you can say thank you is simply click the share button below this video so that others can benefit from this training as well. Okay, we've got a lot to cover, so let's dive in. Okay, so in the last lesson, we got the scene set up. We have our ship flying in, and the ship's meant to be on fire, and it's meant to have like smoke coming out of it, the whole deal. We're not really meant to see the ship per se. We're just going to see it on fire. It's a very quick effect, because if we look at it from the camera perspective, the ship comes in at frame 91. And then it impacts about 14 frames later. So that's about half a second that we actually see it. So it's very quick, but we will see it. It's just more going to be a big amount of fire and smoke, and then obviously all of that is going to linger around. So that's the goal of this lesson, is we're going to create the whole pyro effect of the ship on fire and the smoke and everything, because that's going to help us understand, okay, this thing comes in, it's this big, it hits, how big is the explosion going to be? What else happens in the shot? So we need to get this done first before we then create the explosions and have the rest of the building collapse and really kind of fine tune everything. So the way that we're going to do it in this case is we're going to use Phoenix FD. If you want to use Fume Effects, you're more than welcome to. If you're using Maya, you can use either Phoenix FD or Fume Effects for it. I wouldn't recommend the default fluids in Maya. They're very dated and limited these days. If you want to use Houdini, you can use Pyro Effects. They're all pretty much the same thing. Cinema 4D, you've got Turbulence FD. Cinema 4D and Blender, you can do stuff with them, but there definitely are limitations to those two packages. In terms of feature film, these days for effects, is typically Max and Houdini for everything. So what we want to initially do is we're going to set up the new layers. So I'm just going to get our layer manager under effects. I'm going to create a new layer. We'll just call this PFD ship trails. So dynamics, I'm going to rename this to TYF for Tyflow Dynamics, PFD for Phoenix FD ship trails. And this is where our effect is going to be, and make sure that the little cyan bluish green cyan icon here is active, which means that any objects we create will go in here. So Initially, a couple things we'll want to do is create a Phoenix FD grid. So in the top view, I'm going to zoom out a little bit, and this way we can see our ship. And remember, it was frame 91 that it started, so we'll go to frame 91 so we can see the range we need to build. So again, Phoenix FD, and we want to create a fire smoke sim. And we'll just drag this grid out to encapsulate the entire thing and center it a little bit more. Okay, now one thing we can do, I have a hotkey, I've had this since Max 1, but you can go to motion path, so you can see the trajectory. It's roughly what we want, is we want to make sure that it's in here and it's got a little bit of room to work with. And also beyond here, we want to give it a little bit of bleed as well. So going back in to the modify panel, we'll go grid, and under grid, in fact, we can move to the left side. You see the icon changes a little bit. I'm just going to pull this out so we can see 2 columns. And this just gives us a little bit more room to work with. Now, under grid, we can change the dimensions just like we could a box or anything else. So I'm going to make this a little bit longer, just so we got a bit more room to play with. And we can always tweak it more later on as well. So a couple other things is resolution. We can just decrease a little bit. You know, based on our scale and everything, I'd say we probably want to start with around something like this to begin with, maybe even a little bit lower resolution. And we'll get into this in a moment. In terms of container walls, all that good stuff, we'll get into that in a moment too, but open means that it can be expansive, or we can tell it to be jammed where it treats it like a wall. Open just means that if it clips, it's going to just treat it like it went out of bounds, basically. But we can jam it, so if it hits the wall, it treats it like a floor or a wall. And then we have adaptive grids, so that way we can tell it to actually expand if we needed to. So there's a lot of different controls. We'll get into all this in a moment. The main thing is right now is to set output. So this output rollout, let's just change the directory to a place where you have lots of disk space, because this is where we'll be caching all of our stuff to. So I'm just going to call this PFD, and then we'll call this ship trails V001 underscore. And it's good to version this stuff because, you know, perhaps we want to roll back and have a look at an earlier version, or if we need to free up space, we need to be able to see what the latest take is. So main thing is that we've set up a grid. All we've done is we chose a path where we're saving our cache to. We made sure our resolution's pretty low just to start with, and the dimensions are correct. The next thing that we need to do is we need to set this up as an emitting object. We do have the shelf tools up here, but I'll just, in case you're new to Phoenix, I'd rather get into where these are located. So if you go to create helpers and then down to Phoenix FD, you're going to have in here all the traditional stuff that you're going to use. So in this case, we want a PHX source, and just drag this on the viewport, again, making sure it's all actively being created here. It's good to name the stuff because otherwise it becomes very redundant very quickly. So I'm just going to call this Phoenix FD, PFD, SRC for source, and then ship. So at least this way, if I see SRC, it means it's a source, it's an emitter. In the modifier panel, I'm just going to pick and choose the ship. Going to our Phoenix FD as well, I'm going to call this PFD, and then ship trails render. And again, it's just for me, it just means that this is a renderable object. This is just something I tend to do a lot of when we have a lot of nodes, is to easily identify in every one of these this is renderable. It's partially just good practice, because if you're sick or you travel or whatever, someone calls you in the middle of the night because they need to re-render something of yours, rather than you having to come in to do it, it's very easy to go in and say, okay, well, this is all the renderable stuff for these layers. So it's just easy for other people to understand if I point out that this is the renderable thing, the other stuff isn't. Okay, so all I've done so far is I created a emitter and I chose the ship. So right now we can hit sim and it will work. It'll actually begin simulating and it will automatically read in the emitter. So this is a bit of a pet peeve I have, is that the few tutorials I've seen out there on Phoenix, they tend to, again, just everything seems to be in a tutorial space, which is all wrong. It's really nuts to assume that, like by default with Phoenix, under scene interaction, it's going to say this is your exclusion list, which means that everything is automatically added into this. And that sounds cool in theory, but in production, that's going to shoot yourself in the foot big time in so many different ways. And I can't believe there's training out there that's teaching you to do this, because, again, a lot of the time it's people who don't work in production, but on top of that, they're doing things in a tutorial environment. In other words, they're setting things up where there's like a sphere or a ship or, one object in there, and they're hitting simulate. And that sounds cool, but the way this is set up by default is that it says exclude hidden objects and then exclude nothing else unless it's added in here. So by default, everything in here is visible and is going to simulate if it's visible. And that means that if I have my entire building crumbling and this was actually a collidable object, it automatically would consider all of this, including the tiny little pieces and everything. On top of that, what if I've hidden a bunch of stuff and I go back in, I got to hit sim, my simulation takes 2 days, and then I'm like, oh god, I forgot to unhide my emitter because I hid everything except for the one thing I wanted to render, right? So something that is hidden is automatically going to be considered outside of the interaction group. So it pains me when I see people teaching the wrong way, because this is the sort of stuff that's going to screw you up. And at the last minute, the 11th hour, when you're in the middle of production, you got 1 day left and your sim's going to take 1 day, and then you get it back and you're like, oh my god, I forgot to unhide the wall that it collides with, or whatever. You're setting yourself up for failure. It's really dangerous doing this sort of thing. So it's better to do things right and turn that off, turn inclusion list on, and then we're just going to add in our emitter here. And then we also need to add in the object that it's reading, which is the proxy ship. By doing that, I can hide the stuff, doesn't matter. I can unhide my renderable objects, and it's not going to accidentally include a really detailed object that then bogs down the simulation, causes all these problems and everything else. Typically in production, we'll have like proxy objects. So again, like I might be rendering with the high-res one, which I've actually excluded here because we're not, not dealing with that right now. We're just dealing with the collisions and the emissions, stuff like that. But the high-res version of this thing is so detailed, it has so many bits and pieces. If that was to be included as the collision object, it could greatly slow things down. So hopefully this makes sense, but I strongly urge you never to do that. If you see other people telling you to do it this way, tell them to stop, because again, that's not how you do things in production, and you're setting yourself up for a world of hurt. So it's better to set things up the right way, and that way no problems are going to come up later on. It means if you have multiple grids there, then they're all going to read the emissions. Like, so many problems can happen. It's really bad advice. So, okay, ship coming in, crashes, all that good stuff. We don't have to worry about any of that. We're not going to worry about collisions right now with this trail. We're just focusing on creating the element, okay? So, for now, we've added in the emitter, we've added in the ship that it's emitting from. Both of those are important, but now I can run sim, and here we can use the bar, or you go to simulation start, and we can get it all working from there. So, as we know, it starts at it comes in on frame 91. I'd say we should give this about like 10 frames or something like that head start, but we don't need a sim from frame 70. It's a little overkill. So we'll set timeline off, and we can just type in 83, I don't know, something like that. Let's hit start, and let's just see what happens. It's going to calculate, so as the ship comes in, we can see it's starting to emit, and already we're getting fire and smoke, which is kind of cool. And it's kind of hard to tell like what is going on. So if we go down to preview down here, this is why we've pulled this out a lot more, so we've got a bit more room. We can turn on enable in viewport, and this is going to give us some interesting results. So already we're getting some pretty cool results, and that's the beauty of Phoenix, is that out of the box it does give you some pretty nice overall results from the simulation, and it's mainly to do with the fact that the scale is set up right. As long as the scale is correct, it's going to do a fairly good result. That doesn't mean that if you get your effect and you scale it down to 1 millimeter or 1 centimeter, that it's going to suddenly simulate a match flame, but it does mean that a lot of this, because it is fairly large scale, we're already getting a large scale effect. So right out of the box, that actually looks really good. So I don't think we needed to do too much here, mainly just in the shader, I think. So let's go back into our emitter. A couple of things we can do is we can set the outgoing velocity. This is kind of like if you treat it like a flamethrower or something, it's the best way I can describe it. This is going to be how much it kind of explodes the fluid out, and this is going to help kind of give it more of a rolling effect. So by putting that up fairly high, that's going to help a little bit. Other things we could consider is the velocity inheritance. So we could set this to like 1.5, and that means that it's going to inherit the velocity, and then it's going to obviously multiply it by 1.5. So in other words, the fluid is actually going to push forward ahead of the ship, and that's going to cause it to kind of roll back on itself. So I think that alone is really going to help a lot with just trying to get a bit more of an interesting effect. Beyond that, there's definitely other things we can play with. One of the key things is going to be fuel. So by giving it fuel, obviously that's going to help it burn. And what we can do is we can actually get the fuel to turn to smoke. So we'll turn smoke off, but with the temperature, let's just set this to 300. And this isn't too important because we're going to kill any buoyancy or anything like that. So the stuff's just going to float. It's more just to do with ignition. So we have fuel, we got temperature. That's all we need here. Now we go back into our grid. We'll turn off gravity, and let's scroll down here to enable burning, and we'll just set the ignition to like 290, something like that. Okay, so in other words, as long as the temperature is above 290, in other words, we set the emitter to 300, then it's going to burn and create fire. Okay, so if I run the sim, we can just check out what we've got. It's going to be similar to what we had before, but hopefully it's going to be kind of expansive and fiery, so we can kind of see that already. Obviously, it's too expansive, so we'll get into that in a moment. The other thing is you can see these seams coming through here, and this is because we're sampling once per frame. So here we have steps per frame. This means that it's only calculating once every single frame, and because this ship is moving so quick, because this is reacting fairly quickly as well, there's a lot going on and it's having a hard time keeping up. So you might think, well, I'd rather keep it at 1 frame so that way, you know, maybe I get a few seams, but overall, you know, I can deal with that because I want my sims to be faster. But the thing is that if it cannot keep up, it's more likely to explode, or in a bad way, and create more erratic behavior because it doesn't really understand what happened between one frame and the next. So it isn't just going to give you those kind of visible seams, but it can create very unstable simulations if something's happening too quickly and it can't keep up with it. So for now, let's switch to 2. It won't get rid of the seam entirely, I don't think, but it will hopefully give a bit more of a stable simulation. So I think that's really important to work with. Beyond that, we can set the smoke threshold to 1, and that means that the fuel, no matter what amount of fuel burning, it's going to encourage it still to create more smoke. So I think that's going to be really important as well. And let's set the scale to large here, and that's just going to help kind of set more of a detailed vorticity pattern to it, which will be really important just to get more detail into what we're doing. Besides that, you'll notice that it's expanding very quickly, and that's more to do with the overall energy of the fuel. So we can definitely tweak that. I think having lots of energy is fine. You know, we can keep it at 10 for now, but we can set the depletion to 10 as well, and that means that the fuel is going to deplete a lot more quicker. So I think that's really important. And yeah, just make sure that smoke amount and smoke threshold are both at 1. We can set the propagation to 0, and that actually, this propagation value, when we see the fuel expanding too quickly, it's usually going to be the energy that's causing it, because it's kind of like the expansiveness of the fuel. However, propagation is another value that we can use to bring down the overall expansiveness of it. So by lowering that to 0, it should hopefully kind of calm this down a little bit so it's not so cone-shaped. So we changed a lot of the values here, but basically we're just trying to counteract the fuel energy expansion by getting it to deplete pretty quickly, so that way it's dying out fairly quick. But we also got the propagation, which is hopefully going to help lower the amount that it actually expands. As long as the ignition temperature is lower than the actual temperature, it's going to cause it to burn into fire. And we had the vorticity set to 1. So those are the only things we've really changed so far. One last thing I might do is the conservation. We'll change that to buffered and just up this to like, I don't know, 60 or something. So I'm going through a lot here, but this is stuff that isn't really going to have too much of an impact on your day-to-day stuff. But conservation is just how it's dealing with it, with the overall kind of eddies and internal motion. So if you had like cigarette smoke or something really detailed, you might want to use one of these other ones. But buffered is good from like a general feel where it's going to get a lot of internal motion, but it's going to be fairly quick to deal with it. So by doing that, it's just going to overall be a bit quicker and just simpler in terms of the algorithm, the handles, the smoke, and how it handles itself at a lower density. But on top of that, we're now sampling at 2 times per frame, so it's going to simulate 2 times per frame. And then we've just got this set up where it's just not going to expand as much. Those are the general things that we've changed here. So I'm interested to see how this looks. We might need to increase the detail at this point, just so we can see this a bit more accurately. But as this is simming, we can also go down, and if your detail reduction is set at 1, you can set it to 0, and that might help see a little bit more of like what's going on in the sim. But let's just let this sim for a moment, and we can kind of get an overall idea of the behavior and the motion and what this is going to look like. Also, while this is simming, one thing I have turned on is fuel. It isn't important just yet to have this on, but in terms of the channels we're saving out, it's good to have fuel just in case we want to change our shaders later on to actually render out fuel rather than basing on temperature, which by default it does. We'll also need to output velocity later on too, but I just figured I'd mention this for now. It's not that big a deal, but I'm doing that so that way I've got that information if we want to play around with it. Okay, so I've just simmed a few frames, but we get the general idea. Obviously we'll play with the shader in a little bit, but here we can see the header here is all fire, and then it's transitioning the smoke. And we can see the steppiness has gone down considerably. It's looking a lot better already. So that didn't take too much to do that, and I think that this is looking pretty cool. Plus, if we look at it more in context of what's in frame, that's really what we're seeing. Okay, so that's what's important, is just what we see in camera. So I'm not worried about all the other stuff around here. Couple of things we can do though, going back to create helpers, turbulence. I'm just going to drag this out again, make sure this is the active layer, and we just call this PFD ship turb. Probably name these a little bit better, like ship and then the source rather than how I'm doing it right now, but anyway, it's fine. So I'm just going to set the strength to be a little bit heavier. So let's say like 350 and bring the size down to 60 maybe. And that's just going to give this some additional turbulence overall to help kind of break up the pattern. Now remember, back in our grid, we need to go to scene interaction and add in our turbulence. So once it's showing up, the turbulence will be in there and it will affect it. Besides that, I mean, we're already in a pretty good spot. So I don't think there's too much more I'd want to change. I definitely want to mess with the shader. Cooling can be important for getting fire to cool down overall. However, because we're working at such a low temperature, it doesn't really matter too much. My understanding of cooling is always that it caps off at 300, but we're working at a lower, we're already at 300 basically, so it's not going to cool down beyond that. At least that's my understanding of it, but cooling is just a great way to get fire to burn out quicker. So you up that, the fire will burn out quicker usually. And so we got fuel buoyancy. I'm going to set that to like, I think -4, something like that. And the reason for doing that is just to prevent any fire kind of raising up, because we want this to be kind of so large scale that you don't really see it rising up, you know, because I feel like if we were to have this kind of rising up, it makes it feel like it's a lot smaller. At least that's how I feel, and I want this just to be very uniform in the pattern itself. So just trying to think if there's anything else I would want to do here. I guess like randomization. Again, that's just going to vary all the values a little bit. So it's going to kind of reassign all the values inside of it just to be a bit more chaotic. So that can work pretty well. Ultimately, I want to sample more steps. I definitely want to do that for our final thing because this does move pretty quick. The other thing we could look at is advection. Where is advection? So here we could change that to smoke. And this just means that the grid would expand just in case it needs to make sure it encapsulates the entire thing. So that can be pretty important as well. Now, so smoke dissipation, buoyancy, we're good. Yeah, I think all this is pretty cool. So, like I said, eventually velocity and sampling more times per frame. Those are the two things I would play with. I think overall we've got a pretty good sim already. I mean, I like the fact that it's trailing in, it's keeping up with it, we're getting a lot of detail. So just for fun, I'm going to increase the resolution a little bit. I'm also going to increase the steps per frame. And we can just take a look at how this looks, and then let's just work on the shader and get this to look really, really cool. Okay, so here is our effect. It's looking really good. Obviously, I think it's going way too far along, so we can tweak that. That's not a big deal. The motion, everything else is looking really cool. I'm really digging this. So this is a combination of that motion inheritance as well as the initial velocity that we're shooting out, getting all that rolling going on, as well as the turbulence and all the other things that we've added together. So the end result is something that looks really, really cool. What I'm going to do is we'll just take a closer look at this now. So assuming that you've got your V-Ray lights still in your scene, one thing we haven't done yet is actually set up our renderer. So if we go click on the render, the little teapot with the gears, let's just change this to V-Ray. And I'm going to lower the resolution a little bit just because volumetrics do take a while. We'll keep GI on, we'll go to V-Ray. So the V-Ray tab, we'll change this from progressive to bucket, only because, and we'll set the subdivs to 1 for now, and this to 24, but what I was going to say is only because progressive is great for geometry, progressive isn't so great for volumetrics. We'll keep everything else off, and let's just render out a frame of this, and we'll take a look. Okay, so just going through the rendering, overall this looks pretty good already. A couple of things I want to quickly mention is that I'm actually using the fuel channel, so volumetric options down here. You can see I've set this to fuel. So I think I mentioned this earlier, but make sure when you're simulating to output the fuel channel, otherwise you won't be able to utilize that. So make sure you set that up. And then overall, this is looking pretty cool. So a couple things is, it is kind of blown out. I don't mind it being blown out, but I just don't like the harsh cutoff there. So what we can do is change this from opacity fully visible to use own opacity. And we'll set this really low, like 0.05. And let's just take a look and see how that looks. Okay, so still pretty similar. And then I'm going to set this to about 0.05 as well. And that's going to give us some nicer fall off. So I'm going to lower that a bit more. I still want that blowout, I just don't want it as much. So I think that's looking pretty good. The couple other things I want to mention is make sure we're doing this from the camera view, because it's kind of pointless to be looking at this and judging how big the fire is and everything until we can see it in context. So I think that's looking pretty good. I'm going to jump ahead a couple more frames. Yeah, so I think that's good. I think what we're doing is working out. The smoke opacity we could play with. So smoke opacity, let's try 0.4, and the color, I'll bring it down, whoops, try like 35. This is going to make the smoke a bit darker, and then we still have that illumination. So I think that's looking pretty good. Overall, I think we're in a pretty good spot. Sorry, I didn't mean to actually hit that. So a couple of things that are going on. One thing is obviously the smoke follows through too much. So if we jump ahead, the smoke is going all the way out there, which we don't want. So the way to counteract that will be that around right before impact, I'm going to get my emitter and I'm going to turn on auto key. Let's try set key. So set key, I'm going to set this to 300. Yeah, I never used set key ever, so I thought I'd try it one time, but no luck. So I just turn an auto key on and set that to 300, and fuel I'm going to set to 1. Now the problem with auto key is that it always creates a key at frame 0 of the original value, of like the last value. So we set these, but it's automatically created a key back at frame 0. So just be aware of that. We got to go and delete that key. It's kind of annoying. Now, so frame 104, we just have the values what they were, 300 and 1. So now I'm going to jump ahead, and let's say 3 frames, like 107. We'll just set this to 0 and this to 0. So what's happening, and we turn auto key off now, we can see there's 2 keyframes have been set. One is at a frame 104, and then frame 107. And I'm just going to go into the curve editor and expand these, and we can see that they look all wonky because there's the keyframe set at frame 0. So let's just delete those 2 keyframes. And now we can see that we've got those 2 keyframes set up. One's for temperature, one's for fuel. And that way, all we're doing is we're telling the fire to stop emitting fuel and stop emitting temperature as it goes into the building. And that should hopefully stop it from really following through as much as it does. The other thing, let's just jump to the top viewport, and I'm just going to give this a bit more width. And I'll jump to the right view. I'm going to lower this down a little bit, give it a bit more height. I care more about clipping here than I do anywhere else. I'm also going to move it forward a little bit because this is mostly out of frame anyway. So I'm going to give it a little bit of room just in case the smoke does come through. The other thing we can do is if we click on move and choose local coordinates, when we click on the object, we can see that the Y direction, the arrow is pointing this way, is Y positive. So this would be Y negative this way. So we could actually say to jam the container here if we wanted to. So that way it would actually treat it like a wall, and that would prevent it going through. So if we wanted to do that, we could. Under container walls, we would say Y positive jammed. And that way, if the fluid were to hit there, it would treat it like a wall. It wouldn't go through. So those would be the key things to do. And I might just lower this down. Actually, never mind. In fact, yeah, I'll lower it down just a little bit. I just want to make sure there's plenty of room here. There's no clipping. I'm also going to increase the resolution to slightly. I'm also going to output the velocity. So those key things is velocity, so that way we can do motion blur. Increase the resolution slightly. We could do more steps per frame, but I'm going to keep it on 3. And the shader looks good. Like the motion, everything is looking really good. So I don't think we need to change anything else. I think we're done. I'm going to run a sim just so we can check this out, and hopefully it's looking really cool. Okay, so 2 more minor things we'll quickly do. One is I'm actually going to change this back to open, and the reason is that because it does come close to touching the wall, we might as well just let it die out if it does. So I apologize for that. I just figure at least I'm explaining what it is, but I didn't want the fluid to touch the wall, and it's just inheriting that motion, which is frustrating. So let's just keep it open. We'll make the adaptive grid based on temperature. This shouldn't make any real difference, but it's just basically if the smoke is cool, then it's not going to continue to expand the grid because of that. It's not really going to make too much of a difference whether it's smoke or whether it's temperature. It's just whether or not the grid expands based on one or the other. So like I said, those 2 things don't really make that much of a difference. It's just more we're making it so the wall, the edge of the grid isn't a you know, a collision object basically. And the only thing that will impact this quite drastically is, let's go to create panel, space warps here, and click drag, and we'll just drag this into the viewport and go to the modify panel. Okay, so what drag does is it decays the velocity. In other words, it slows things down, and you can actually use this on your fluids. So what I want to do is, as our fluid's coming in, there's a certain frame where we begin to cool things down. In other words, if I click on the emitter, yeah, it's like 104, I'd say, around there. So what we can do is perhaps at 104 to 115. Let's do 105 to 115. And we'll make this like 8, something like that. So all we're doing, it's weird, I thought these automatically link up. Anyway, so what we're doing is, by having this on, it means just for half a second, it's just going to stump the velocity 8%. So in other words, it's going to bring it down. It's going to start to exponentially slow it down. Which just means that I'm hoping it's going to come to a halt before it hits the wall. Okay, so that's the only change that we're making here, really. The other stuff was more just doing a bit of housekeeping, which is helpful, but isn't really going to make or break or change anything too drastically. But adding the drag will, for the next 10 frames or half a second, stump the momentum, so it'll slow down towards the end. And that's just going to help it kind of stay in a fixed place, because before it was kind of like mushrooming and hitting the wall because it's moving so quick. So the final thing we'll do is in the modify panel, scene interaction. Let's click add, and we'll add the drag in here. Now when you run the simulation, it is going to pop up saying, just FYI, you've got the space warp called drag affecting this, and that's fine. Just be aware of that, because sometimes you'll hit sim. It's kind of frustrating when it's added in, because you know, it would make sense if it had an exclusion list, so it's just, you know, including everything. But in this case, we're specifically mentioning that you're going to use drag. So it shouldn't tell me like, hey, by the way, you got drag in here, because we told it to. But just be aware of that, because there's times I hit sim and I walk away and I come back and it's saying it hasn't started the sim because it's just telling me that drag's affecting it. So I got to click OK. So I just want to mention that ahead of time. But I'm going to run the sim, and like I said, the only thing really we've changed here is just I added drag. That's the only main thing. And let's set this to slightly higher resolution. I'll fiddle around, like whatever resolution works best for you, but I want this to be the final sim, so I want to add some detail to it. Okay, so we'll pause this and we'll come back and check out the results. So this is a slightly lower resolution version, but as we scrub through, we can see that the fluid comes in and begins to halt right around there, which is well inside of our building. So that's the main thing, is we want to set this up in a way that it's not continuing to move on and hitting the wall or getting too big. So we've managed to set that up. So here we can see where the building is. The fluid is sitting inside of that. Now, if we want to, later on, we can actually add in collision objects. So as the building comes down, it's actually going to pull all of this fluid down with it. There is going to be so much going on, though, that it isn't necessary. If you want to run your final sim for this now, I lower the detail temporarily, but you could probably put it to 16 or a little bit higher than that, depending on what you're going for. Now, once you do run your sim, though, you're pretty much good with that, because we'll have so much other stuff going on that this whole area is full of explosions and dust and smoke that you're not going to see that. However, I think it's video 7 we'll be going through creating the collision objects, so that way Phoenix can read all of the geometry of the building collapsing. So if you ever did want to have this actually collide with that, then we can do that. I pick and choose my battles, because obviously adding lots and lots of broken geometry in is going to slow the sim down. So I do it where it's necessary to get a certain result, or interaction is really important. But all I'm looking for with this particular effect is to have this smoke column and fire coming in. So as long as it looks good here, that's all I care about. I'm not as concerned here, because I guarantee we're not going to see the interaction. Whereas we will with the explosions, for instance. It's very critical that we have the explosions pushing through the windows as well as curling around the building, and as the building comes down, it pulls it down with it. So there's definitely going to be some simulations that are very necessary to have the collision objects and everything animated. But at this point, we've got a really good result. We've managed to get this smoke effect coming in. We've managed to get it to do exactly what we want when we want, as well as get the overall look working. So I think this has turned out really good, and I'm excited to move on to the next lesson as we continue to move forward with getting everything set up. Okay, I hope you got a lot from this lesson. Like I said, we're just getting started. There's loads to come, and in the next few lessons, we're going to get heavy into the destruction, the dynamics, and doing some really epic stuff. I'm excited to get into doing explosions and fire and so much more. I'm really excited to see what you can come up with this training, so feel free to send me an email and show me updates of your work as you go through it. In the next lesson, we're going to dig deep into a lot more production effects, and there's so much more coming. I'm so excited for this. So this is going to be a wild ride. Feel free to reach out to me on Instagram as well, Alan McKay Official, and share your work with me. I would love to not only check out some of this stuff, but also share it with others so we can all see what we're doing and make this more of a collaborative environment. Plus, I'd love to nerd out and check out all the cool stuff that you're doing too. So feel free to hit me up on Instagram. I've left a link below this video to that. I'll be back next video. Keep an eye out for video 3 in your inbox shortly.